All right, let's get started. Thank you all for being here. Glad that Frank is with us. Glad you're doing well. So last week we left off kind of around 160 BC with the death of Judas Maccabeus. And I want to talk about kind of the remaining 60 years that will bring us up to 100 BC. And I'm not going to expect you to remember a lot of details. I'm going to give you a rough sketch outline. I probably won't do it in chronological order either. However, what I really want you to remember is, and I will explicitly do this, I'm going to make some connections to the New Testament. In other words, as we go through this period, we see certain things develop and we see evidence of it in the New Testament. And so at least tonight you're going to find out kind of where that thing in the New Testament originated. Does that make sense to everybody? Right? So don't worry about remembering the history and all that. You'll become my favorite student if you do. But really what we want to do, and really the goal of this entire class, is to illuminate the New Testament. Because, I mean, there's such a huge gap in the history. So, we come to Judah's death, and the Maccabean revolt, the leadership, or the leading that movement falls to his brother Jonathan. Okay, and so he's the new leader. The problem is, though, that the Maccabean revolt has been running out of steam. The Seleucids, the Syrian, kind of mini empire, Antiochus. Antiochus is dead, the fourth anyway. But they're the ones that have chipped away at the Maccabeans' strength, and it is really, really, really floundering. You're starting to see a break, or not so much a break, but people segmenting into groups. You have the Sadducees. They are the ones who promote the fact that the high priest needs to be from the Zadokite dynasty. And then you have the Pharisees, and they're more laity, they're more common people. They're not a part of the priestly class, but they are super conservative. And during this period, we see the formation of the oral law among the Pharisees. So they talked about how they had the written law, and then they had the oral law. And by the time of Jesus, their oral law has kind of superseded what's actually written in the law. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. But it's during this period that we start to see the development of that oral law. And it was really intriguing to me. They start taking things one step further. Later in the story, there is a high priest that they're not entirely sure is qualified to be high priest. And of course, there's some politicking going on. I'm sure they didn't get along all that well. They're not exactly inviting each other to their Christmas parties. But they basically said, well, okay, so the high priest, this is the logic of the Pharisees, all right? This is going to be like, wow, so they were that crazy 160 years before Jesus. So they said, okay, the law says that the high priest must marry a virgin in Israel, all right? And from that, they basically extrapolated it to the fact that the high priest at the time, his mother at one point had been raped. And so they said, well, because she was raped, irregardless of when she had you, then you're not a proper high priest. Because you could be the child of that. And you're sitting there going, wait, what? But again, you're seeing this oral law develop. Again, so much so that you get to the New Testament and they are tithing dill, mint, and cumin, but obviously neglecting the weightier measures of the law. You can read Matthew 23 to get a good synopsis of what Jesus thought about the Pharisees. You tie burdens and put them on other people, but you don't dare try to lift them or live by those rules yourselves. So we see that development. So Jonathan is the leader of the Maccabean revolt, and slowly but surely, what you start to see is around the time that Jonathan starts to lead the Maccabean revolt, and it's kind of on its last legs, right, you start to see some civil war, some civil strife among the Seleucids. Okay, you got different leaders within the Seleucid, the Syrian Empire, and they are jockeying for power. They're trying to double cross one another, and people are picking sides. At one point, there's a pretty bad famine going on that is caused by Rome and labor problems in Rome, and it affects the entire area. But there's a famine going on, and so obviously people are like, hey, we ain't got food, and that makes everybody cranky, okay? During this time also, the Maccabees will work towards liberating Jerusalem completely and Judea from the rule of any foreign power. But for a long time, the one thing they can't seem to get rooted out is the Acra and the polis, the Greek kind of, barracks and the Greek part of the city of Jerusalem. This is located in what we now know as the city of David and what was then known as the city of David. It's the part of the Jerusalem where it's the oldest part, okay? The area around where the palace was and near the Temple Mount. This whole time, next to the temple, there has been the Acra, which has been kind of a barracks government facility. And then also, brothers, one of the things that he's able to do is also become a man of international prestige. He sends envoys to Rome looking to see if they can help Israel out by at least officially recognizing them as their own independent state. And as a result, if anybody tried to mess with Israel, Rome would come back and say, hey, everybody go back to your corners. Rome, as we go along, is involved more and more and more and more with this area of the world, okay? They are the power brokers. They're the ones that tell everybody to sit down and be quiet and stop fighting and, love each other. Not really. The Romans are the ones who will keep an eye on things, and if they think anybody's getting too powerful, if they think one of the Ptolemy rulers in Egypt is getting more powerful, or if there's one of the Seleucid rulers in Syria that's getting too powerful, they're going to come in and kind of, rig the game so that things equal out a little bit. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. So Rome is increasing in its power and in its influence. It's also during this time that Rome comes to basically own, control, and make a province of both Greece and Asia Minor. Okay, they burn Corinth and I think it's Philippi or Macedon. They burn two of those Greek cities, those slapped to the ground, and start over. Okay, and they also completely annihilate Carthage, that long-standing rivalry between Carthage and Rome. Hannibal and the elephants and the mountains, all of those things going on. So Rome is getting more and more powerful. Jonathan, though, doesn't get all the concessions from Rome that he was looking for. And at this point, he's basically trying to figure out which leader in the competing factions of the civil war, of the infighting in Syria, he's trying to figure out which one he's going to back. Because if he starts backing the right horse, then when that guy eventually wins and comes out on top, then that's going to be really good for Israel. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. And so this is a period where there's a lot of weird alliances suddenly forming and then dissolving and forming. People that hated each other or were at war with each other just last year are suddenly best buddies. And then the opposite is true. People that were in alliance with each other have double-crossed each other, and now they're fighting each other. There's just a lot of that shifting going on. Eventually, Jonathan is made high priest, and that's kind of what he's been angling for. And this is another development. You start to see the high priest become the all-ruling authority in Israel. He is the cultural leader. He is the military leader. He is the civic leader. He's kind of the all-around leader. Military, religious, civic, all of those things rolled into one. And the role of the high priest continues to become more and more and more powerful, so that by the time we get to the New Testament, it's almost purely a political position. And because the Romans are then in charge, it doesn't have any military, role. But certainly the high priest is considered the leader or the figurehead of the entire Jewish nation. Okay, that's what we're going to see eventually come to pass. But it starts during this period of the Hasmonean dynasty. Jonathan eventually backs the right horse and is successful in getting a lot of concessions made for the Israelites. And he goes with an armed guard with the new leader of the Seleucids to a particular town to kind of celebrate. And as soon as they're inside the city gates, the Syrian ruler that's now come out on top, he double crosses him and executes him. Okay. And so and of course everybody's livid, all right, but they can't really do anything. And this brought his brother Simon. Simon is going to be the last of the Maccabean brothers. This brings Simon to the high priesthood and kind of taking on the Maccabean mantle. And some things really start to develop under Simon. Again, the infighting with all the Greeks continues. And during this period, the Syrian Empire becomes weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. To the east of Syria, you've got the Parthians and a few other tribes or nations that are taking away territory. Okay? And Jamie, when you have this empire and all of these provinces that you've ruled over and had sovereignty over start to be taken away from you, it's not just the loss of territory and prestige. What also are you losing out on?
You're basically losing power. Money, yeah.
Tax money, tax revenue, massive loss of tax revenue. And this starts to put the Seleucid Empire in dire straits. Eventually, on two different occasions, they get to the point where they don't have money to pay their army. And literally their army quits on two different occasions. Okay? They quit. Everybody goes home. If you can't pay us, we're going home. And so again, the empire, the Syrians are becoming weaker and weaker and weaker. Sometimes the Ptolemies try to come in and run things. They are intermarrying with the Seleucids. Somebody will marry somebody's daughter, and the father-in-law will try to exercise his influence in the Ptolemy father-in-law will try to exercise his influence over the Seleucids because he's now, you're my son-in-law and you're going to do what I tell you to do. That never goes well. At least once Rome has to come in and say, yeah, we're not doing this. Everybody go back to your corner again. But the Seleucids are slowly, their power is eroding. And during Simon's rule as high priest, again, military leader, at one point he goes on campaign in Syria with one of the Syrian leaders trying to get on his good side. But the priesthood becomes more and more and more and more powerful under Simon. I found this absolutely fascinating. They dared not call him king for two reasons. One, it was going to tick off a lot of people that, hey, you're not supposed to have a king. You're not completely independent. But the other reason is a lot of people still had the problem with the king and the high priest being one and the same person. Because they have always been separate, have they not? Okay? The role of king and the role of priest has never been one and the same. High priest has never been one and the same. And so they're like, look, we know you're the military leader and the civic leader and the religious leader, but we're not going to give you the title of king because we just can't do that. And so what happens is there is a new phrase that is begun to be used for Simon. Coins are minted during this time, which we still have some of those coins. Coins are minted during this time, and it has Simon's profile, and on it, he will be referred to as not just the high priest, but the great high priest. Now, I was unaware of that. In the New Testament, they're referred to the chief priests, but great high priest is a phrase we only come to in the book of Hebrews. And so it has me wondering, again, I haven't run this down, but it has me wondering if that phrase in Hebrews is pregnant, not just with Jesus being the greatest of greatest, lordliest of lordliest, high priest, very top of the food chain, but also, we certainly would see him as a spiritual military leader. Does that make sense? Okay. It's just interesting, the cultural concept of a great high priest. This began during the time of Simon. Simon has a son-in-law who is from Egypt. He's one of the Ptolemies. He marries his daughter, and he becomes the governor around Jericho. And so Simon and his family go on a little trip to visit their daughter and son-in-law in Jericho for a little family get-together. And this is when Ptolemy, again, his son-in-law to Simon, brings his thugs in, okay? And it's rumored that he killed Simon. That turns out not to be the case. But he also took Simon's wife and two of his sons prisoner. And again, there's this outrage, okay? Jonathan was double-crossed. Simon has now been double-crossed by his own son-in-law. And word goes out to Simon's son, John, who's about 20, mid-20s. And he believes that his father is dead, and he doesn't know what's happened to his mother and his two brothers. And so he starts to exercise authority as the new ruler. And he starts to exercise authority as the high priest. Even though you had to be 30 to be the high priest, he's like, look, everybody else is dead. Come to find out, Simon is still alive, and the mother and the brothers are still alive. Okay? But eventually Ptolemy and the Seleucids, they execute Simon and his sons. I forget what happened to the mother, but I think she's killed. But they executed Simon and his sons and dumped their bodies in a valley. Okay? So you can imagine that this, again, ticks everybody off. And again, throughout this time, you would think that some of these setbacks would erode Israel, Judah trying to gain independence, but actually it's fueling it, okay? As people witness these awful crimes against them, murdering the high priest essentially and parts of his family, people are getting more and more, look, we just can't tolerate this anymore. And so John arguably becomes, the most powerful ruler of the Hasmonean dynasty. He will later go by John Hyrcanus. Okay, we're not entirely sure how he got that nickname, but that's how Josephus refers to him, is Hyrcanus, John Hyrcanus. And he becomes a very powerful ruler. It is certainly under him, more so than under Simon, it's certainly under him that Israel becomes its own free state. Rome gives more concessions to the Jews. In fact, at one point, Hyrcanus got, this might have been Simon, but one of them, at one point, either Simon or Hyrcanus got really ticked off that the Seleucid army tramped through their territory because they're like, hey, we're a free state and you just can't march through our land without our permission. The Seleucid army marched through their land to go to Egypt and fight the Ptolemies, and that really ticked Israel off. And so they appealed to Rome, and Rome said, okay, we are respecting your territory, and if anybody comes through your territory, They don't even have to be invading you. But if anybody, a foreign power comes into your territory, we will intervene. Do you remember our study of Kings, particularly 2 Kings? And during that time period, the southern kingdom of Judah would often appeal to what nation to get them out of trouble with other nations? Egypt. And you see in the prophets, don't go down to Egypt and look for help. The Lord of armies is like, what am I, chopped liver? Okay? And so you see that especially in Isaiah, you see it in Jeremiah, that don't go down to Egypt. Don't cast your lot in with Egypt. I brought you out of Egypt. I don't want you going back there. And the principle is, be careful about who you get to fight your battles for you, and be careful about who you get in bed with, because it may not turn out well for you. And Judah, always appealing to Rome to get some monkey off their back, it's not going to end well, right? Because we know what happens in AD 70, okay? But again, Rome is becoming more and more and more and more and more involved. Hyrcanus is successful in grabbing more territory by fighting battles and getting concessions from the Seleucids in exchange for various things. There are two regions particularly, There are three regions that he's able to basically take over and infuse with a lot of Jewish settlers. One is the area of Galilee. This entire time, Galilee has basically become Greek. Galilee isn't predominantly Jewish at all. Jews are much in the minority in the Galilean region. Under Hyrcanus, that starts to change, so that by the time you get to the time of Christ, they are heavily infused with Jews, but there's still a lot of Greeks that live in the area, and there are some towns that are almost exclusively Greek in their culture. Okay, I'm trying to remember, I think the name of the town is Sepphoris. It was a Hellenistic city in Galilee. There were a lot of building projects that took place during the time that Jesus would have been growing up. And it was not far from Nazareth. And it's very, very likely, certainly possible, and I would say likely, that Joseph and Jesus would have done some building in this city of Sepphoris. That is, again, something we can't absolutely prove, of course, but it's highly likely. Another region that he's able to, again, kind of bring into the fold is the area across the Jordan. There had always been some Jews that are living there, but again, that becomes the territory of the Israelites once again. And then you have Idumea. Does anybody know where Idumea was located? You will hear it referred to in the New Testament. Herod is called an Idumean.
It's south of Hebron.
Okay, so actually during this time period, Hebron is in Idumean territory. Okay, Hebron I think is about 20 miles south of Jerusalem. And somewhere between Jerusalem and Hebron, it becomes Idumea. And this entire time, it's been its own province, okay? It's not connected that closely to the things going on in Jerusalem. It is made up predominantly of the remnant of the Edomites, okay? Idumean is, I think, Greek for Edomite, right? But they've started to do some things to sort of kind of culturally align with the Jews. And one of them is that for a while, really conservative Idumeans would circumcise their male children. The more progressive ones did not. Well, when they are actually taken over by Hyrcanus, he basically says, you've got two options. You can circumcise yourself or you can leave. Right? If you're, we don't care how old you are as a man, you either circumcise yourself or you find another place to live, not in this province. And so a lot of people leave the territory because of that. Others go through the circumcision process, again, painful for an adult. But beginning then, almost all the Idumeans will circumcise their children. Now, here's why that is significant. Remember we talked about how it was during this entire period between the Testaments that four main things became really critical to the Jewish identity, right? Circumcision, Sabbath keeping, paying the temple tax, and kosher laws. Well, one of the things that starts to happen in Judaism is they become more amenable to the idea that Gentiles can join up with Judaism, but you have to be circumcised. You know, we're not going to play this card of, oh, we're the elect of God, and sorry, you're out because, you know, you didn't win the DNA, you know, genetic lottery, okay? If you are willing to circumcise yourself and obey the Torah, then we will consider you a part of us. And when you get to the New Testament, that becomes the view of the early Christians who were Judaizers. Do you see that? You have Jews in other places, and the Gentiles are being brought into the church, and so they're like, well, okay, but you need to be circumcised in order to be one of us. And that's why we have Paul becoming apoplectic in the book of Galatians. Again, probably the crudest phrase in the New Testament. He talks about people that are for circumcision, and he says in one part of Galatians, I wish they would go all the way and just cut it completely off. I wish they would emasculate themselves, but it's a little bit more graphic in Greek. I just wish they would go all the way and cut it all off. Okay? That's how angry Paul is writing the book of Galatians. Funny thing, that point was never made in one of my Sunday school classes growing up as a kid. I don't remember that coming up at VBS. I don't. But again, the reason that Judaizing Christians were insisting that Gentiles be circumcised, and they even insist on that. I mean, James, the brother of Jesus, they write that letter in Acts 15, okay? The reason they're insisting on this is because as Jews, that's what they had been insisting on. Slowly but surely, they had come to this idea that, okay, we're going to welcome the Gentiles in, but they got to be circumcised. Now, why would they be open to the Gentiles joining Judaism? And remember our study of the prophets. What was prophesied about the nations toward the end of all these prophetic books?
That they would grab a hold of the skirt of the Jew and say, we'll go with you.
Yeah, so basically you have this idea of the nations flowing into Jerusalem. And so the Jews start to think, well, okay, so we can either be, incredibly racist and just exclude them all, okay, as God's chosen people. We are set apart, we're holy, so we're not letting any interlopers in, no matter what they do. Or we can be more amenable to them joining our cause, as long as they're circumcised. And maybe, just maybe, we will then bring about the coming of the Messiah because the Gentiles are flowing, the nations are flowing into Jerusalem and Judaism. Do you see the logic? Kind of dumb, but they're trying to trigger the coming of the Davidic Messiah by doing this. Another thing that Hyrcanus does, Simon was doing it, Hyrcanus really goes a long way towards doing it, is he's expanding the borders of the free state of Israel to where they more resemble the borders that were traditional in the Old Testament, from Dan to Beersheba, etc. And so again, people are like, man, we really like this free state stuff. And man, things are kind of going back to the way they used to be. Hyrcanus, as we go down from Jonathan to Simon to Hyrcanus and beyond, the leaders of the Jews in the Hasmonean line, they become far less religious and way more secular. The original Maccabean brothers and their father, they were, really gung-ho, super conservative, religious, but only in a cultural way, okay? But they were certainly devout. They were strictly keeping the law. By the time we get to Hyrcanus and others, it's just a cultural, going through the motions type of thing. Hyrcanus is probably most famous for launching a campaign against the city of Samaria. Okay? And there was a beautiful temple on the top of Mount Gerizim. This temple was internationally known. We have plaques elsewhere in the Greek world that have survived that made reference to the temple on Mount Gerizim. And say, hey, we know about this temple and it's a great thing. It was probably one of their 7 wonders of the world. I don't know. But that temple on Mount Gerizim was really, really, really prestigious. It was really big. I mean, it had basically government offices in there. It was about the size of the Acropolis in Athens. Okay? So look at the size of the Acropolis in Athens. That was the size of this temple. And Hyrcanus burned it slap to the ground. Now, why would he do a thing like that? Who are the Samaritans? This isn't something we've really gone into detail about. But who are the Samaritans?
They're basically transplants from Assyria.
They are transplants from Assyria. They intermingled with some residual Israelites, okay? They are mutts. Now, a lot of them claim Yahweh as their God and worship Him. They worship Him on Mount Gerizim. Hyrcanus is driven not so much by they're worshiping in the wrong place. They need to be worshiping in Jerusalem. It's just, he basically can't stand that there's another temple in his area, and he wants to consolidate power by forcing everybody to come to Jerusalem. You understand the difference? Okay? This is more a power grab than it is a standing righteously for the law. He burns it slap to the ground. Earlier in the period, remember the Samaritans were ratting out the faithful Jews to Antiochus IV. So they weren't making any friends, and now Hyrcanus comes in roughly 60, 70 years later, and he burns the temple to the ground. And this is really where the relationship between Jews and Samaritans fractures. Frayed, stressed up to this point, now it fractures. And they hate each other. During the time of Jesus, the Jews would not stay in a Samaritan town overnight. Okay? That's why when Jesus wants to stop at the well, and he's kind of taking his time, the apostles are like, Lord, what are you doing? Okay? So there is this hatred. Again, when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, okay? This is a person who was hated by the Jews listening to the story. And whereas a priest and a Levite couldn't be bothered to help this guy, an Islamic fundamentalist comes by and sees this poor beaten up Christian and takes care of him and takes him to the Holiday Inn and says, hey, he needs to stay here, take care of him, here's some money, I'll come back later and pay the whole bill, but this guy needs to be taken care of. That's how it would have helped or hit Jesus' audience. But it's this period during Hyrcanus that things really become super fractured. All right, Hyrcanus dies, and his son Aristobulus takes over. And he goes on a rampage, gaining more and more territory, but the power goes to his head. Again, he's only in his 20s when he takes power. And this is really where the rule about being 30 to be the high priest is officially relaxed. They say, well, you got to be 20. You had to be 20 to be a Levite under the law, okay? So they're going to say, well, if you're 20, you can be high priest. And Aristobulus becomes the high priest. He has his mother and his brothers killed, except for one brother, Antigonus, who he's fond of. But Aristobulus becomes more and more and more and more paranoid until he starts to suspect that Antigonus is out to get him. Aristobulus falls gravely ill. Again, he only reigns or rules the roost for 10 months. and it's one of the feast days, and he's not there to officiate, so his brother Antigonus stands in his place. And, you know, it could have been Antigonus kind of trying out the position. Let me see if I like this. It could have been just, hey, I'm just doing this because my brother can't. We don't know. But Aristobulus finds out that he did this without his okay, and he is convinced he needs to be executed because, I mean, we can't be having this. I can't have a brother that's trying to unseat me. My read on the situation, 2,000 years removed, is that he was incredibly paranoid and there was nothing going on. He basically sends a message to Antigonus, says, come by my house and do not have any weapons on you. It's a trap. And he orders his soldiers, the guard, if he comes with a weapon, kill him on the spot. As Aristobulus' wife, who is really close with Antigonus, sends him a message say, hey, when you come to this meeting, wear your best armor. Make a good impression. And there's a few people that think that she's trying to go in cahoots with her husband and get rid of Antigonus, but it seems as if she was like, no, authentically, you're going to look good in a great suit of armor, so make sure you wear your armor and come by for that meeting. The guards see him in his armor, not a weapon, but they see him in his armor, and they execute him, they kill him, assassinate him. Aristobulus dies of his sickness just a few days later. And that's going to give rise to another has-been leader that we'll start talking about next week. But this has brought us up to around 100 BC. Things are going to continue to go from bad to worse. The expectation of a Davidic messianic figure just simply continues to grow and grow and grow and grow. Even in the time of Judas Maccabeus, and just becoming more and more concerning after that, people had a problem with the violence, some of their strong-arm tactics that the Maccabeans would use. People were wary. They were wary about one group in Judaism having that much power. And as the Hasmonean dynasty became the military leader, the civic leader, and the religious leader, they're like, ooh. That's why they won't give them the title king. By the way, Aristobulus, who we just talked about, he's the one that takes the title of king for himself. He's the first one to do that. The first king of Israel since before they went into Babylonian captivity. Okay? And this is 500 years later. People are getting though wary, and they deal with it in different ways. So the Sadducees, they've become less insistent that the priest be from the line of Zadok. They basically become pragmatists. They're like, look, realpolitik, we're just going to kind of make our peace with the times, whatever they are, in order to survive. And that's why when we come to John chapter 11, at the very end of the chapter, you have the scene where Caiaphas is saying, hey, Jesus has become too powerful and we need to execute him. And he says it's better that one man die than the entire nation be destroyed. Because if we don't kill him, the Romans are going to come in here and destroy the nation. He's the high priest. He's being pragmatic. He wants Jesus to die because he knows that he believes that if Jesus gets more power, the Romans are going to be like, nope, 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 and come in and destroy the nation. And John actually says, basically, he spoke greater truth than he knew. It's better that one man die for the entire nation than the nation be destroyed. You look at that through a different lens and you're like, oh. You have the Pharisees that are, again, very popular with the people, and they are not pragmatists at all. Absolutely not. They are idealists. They're not as idealistic as later the Zealots and the Essenes, but they're idealists that are still living in general society. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, they're not the really wacko people out there, you know. The Pharisees, though, are super conservative. They've developed this huge body of oral tradition, and they're the ones who are really holding out for a Davidic Messiah to come about. Again, that's where the thing that if we keep, everybody in Israel keeps the law perfectly for one day, we will trigger the coming of the Davidic Messiah. That's where it came from. It's part of the reason why they were so ticky-tacky on rules, etc., because they're like, guys, if you can just cooperate, we can do this thing. They really start holding on to the Davidic Messiah concept. Here's the problem with that time period, however. As the Hasmoneans gained more and more power religiously, civically, militarily, as they gained more and more power, it became very clear the power is just going to everybody's heads. And this isn't the Davidic Empire restored like we thought it was going to be. Being an independent free state isn't all we thought it would be. And that's why there continues to be dissatisfaction. The people in the time of Jesus that were looking for the Davidic Messiah didn't want to go back to the glory days of the Maccabees. They wanted to go back to the glory days of David, when there was a strong king on the throne, a man after God's own heart, a man that could lead them in battle, a man who was righteous, you know, good with a harp, okay? They wanted to go back to the Davidic ideal that had been presented in the prophets. I mean, the Pharisees and the Essenes are all reading the prophets right now, memorizing the prophets, okay? Interestingly enough, the Sadducees have no use for the prophets. Not necessarily because they think that they didn't speak for God at one time, but they basically say prophecy doesn't exist anymore. So we're just not going to care about what the prophets said at one time. They are pragmatists to a fault. This is kind of where things are in 100 BC. And so the things that I want you to think about developing, one, the insistence on circumcision for Gentiles coming into Judaism and then Christianity. I want you to think about the role of the high priest and how powerful it became, how political it became. Okay, I want you to think about the dissatisfaction with this isn't really what we thought the Davidic Messiah was going to be. This isn't even close. All right, you have several of those things going on, and then obviously the Samaritans when you get to the New Testament. Questions? All right, so the last thing that I want to do, it was during this period that a book was written, and it was a work of fiction. My understanding is that everybody knew when it came out it was a work of fiction. It never claimed to be inspired by God, and almost everybody, I think, was on board with the fact that this is a work of fiction. The name of the book is called Judith. It's about a woman. Her name literally means Jew. Judith means Jew. So if you know a woman named Judith, it means Jew. That's all it means. And she is representative of the entire Jewish nation. Judith was written by a Pharisee during this time period. So I want us to watch the intro video to the book of Judith. It's in the Apocrypha, the Old Testament Apocrypha, but it's not part of the canon. The Jews in the first century didn't accept it as part of the canon. But I want us to watch, and I want you to think about some themes that are talked about in this video.
It's the thrilling story of an Israelite woman's courageous faith in God that topples an evil empire. The events of Judah's story are set in Israel of the 7th and 6th centuries BC, when Jerusalem was threatened and attacked by the empires of Assyria and then Babylon. But the anonymous author who wrote the book lived hundreds of years later, sometime in the 2nd to 1st century BC. This was when Jews around Jerusalem were under the oppressive empires of Greece and then Syria. In the author's recent memory is the Syrian king Antiochus, who declared that he was a god. He attacked Jews in Jerusalem and then defiled the temple. This resulted in the famous Maccabean revolt, a successful Jewish rebellion against their Syrian oppressors. You can go read the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees for the whole story. The author of Judith wanted to help people understand the meaning of these recent events, and so he wrote a parallel story inspired by ancient biblical events.
A parallel
this
story.
explains a number of unique features about the book. For example, the story opens by introducing the bad guys: Nebuchadnezzar, king of Assyria, and his military general, Holofernes. But Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon, not Assyria, and Holofernes was a general in the empire of Persia, which came long after Assyria.
Oops.
But this is not a mistake by the author. Rather, he's intentionally combined three of the most oppressive empires from the biblical story into one mega enemy. They've become a symbol for any prideful and violent ruler that acts like their god.
The whole story is a metaphor.
Of recent memory. Nearly every scene and character in the book of Judith has symbolic meaning based on earlier biblical predecessors. Even Judith herself. Her name in Hebrew means Jewish woman, and almost all of her words and actions are patterned after courageous figures in the Hebrew scriptures who also had showdowns with foreign leaders. Judith is Deborah, Jael, Esther, Moses, David, and Daniel, all combined into one mega heroine. Through this showdown of mega characters, the author of Judith is reflecting on a key theme in the whole biblical story, about the surprising ways that God's kingdom overturns the violent empires of our world. The book of Judith wasn't considered part of the Hebrew scriptures in Jewish tradition or in later Protestant tradition. But in the early centuries of the Christian movement, the book's Greek translation was widespread and really popular. And so today, it's part of the Catholic and Orthodox Deuterocanon collections. Let's dive into the story. It begins with King Nebuchadnezzar, who is full of himself one day, so he declares war on his eastern neighbor, the Medes. And so he forces the smaller kingdoms around him in the east to help him fight. But then he also summons the western kingdoms that include the Israelites. They all refuse to join Nebuchadnezzar's alliance. And this makes him really mad. So he declares that when he's done crushing the Medes, he'll destroy these rebellious western nations. He appoints his second-in-command, Holofernes, as a military general to go defeat and enslave these rebel nations to make them worship Nebuchadnezzar as a god. And most of the nations do surrender, but not the Israelites. When they hear about Holofernes and his armies, they fast and pray, asking God to show mercy, to save their temple, and to keep them from ending up in exile again. And while we read that God hears their prayer, we're not told how he's going to deliver them. You have to keep on reading. Holofernes and his armies arrive to confront the rebel Israelites. He asks the neighboring kings, who are these Israelites, and who's their ruler? It's Achior, the king of the Ammonites, who speaks up. He retells the biblical story of how Israel's God defeated Egypt and saved them in Exodus, and how he handed Israel over to defeat and exile in Babylon because of their sins. Achior warns Holofernes that he won't be able to overcome these people unless Israel's God allows it. Notice the irony. This is a non-Israelite king giving Holofernes a Bible study lesson on God's power. But Holofernes is not amused. He honors King Nebuchadnezzar as the all-powerful God, and so he banishes Achior to the hills of Israel to be killed in the coming attack. Holofernes' army assembles at the foot of a mountain pass so they can gain entry into Israel, but there's one thing standing in their way, the Israelite hill town of Bethulia. When the Israelites living there see this massive army, they freak out, and they test God by saying, if they're not saved within 5 days, they're going to surrender. And right as things look totally helpless, the author introduces Judith. She's an Israelite widow in Bethulia who trusts God with radical faith. She hears of this plan to surrender to Holofernes, and she confronts the town leaders, saying that Nebuchadnezzar's army is nothing compared to God's power and wisdom. She recalls how God tested the Israelites' faith in the past. This is one more chance to trust God in the face of evil. The leaders ask Judith to pray for all of Israel, and so she does. It's a majestic prayer, combining phrases from poems all over the Hebrew scriptures about how God helps the weak and how he loves to overturn the power structures of our world. God exalts the humiliated and humiliates the exalted. Judith asks God to grant her success, and then she announces to her people that she has a secret plan to turn the destructive power of this great empire back onto itself. And from here on, the story is full of creative ironies and reversals. Judith dresses up like a queen, and she marches down into the army camp to speak with Holofernes. When the powerful general sees Judith, he's overpowered by his desire, and he's easily taken in by her crafty plan. Judith tells Holofernes that he can't defeat the Israelites unless their God allows it. And God will allow Holofernes to win as long as he lets Judith leave the camp every night to pray. Then she'll tell him when to attack. Judith says with deep sarcasm, "God has sent me to do something with you that will astonish the whole world." And Holofernes has no clue. But he's thrilled, and he agrees to her plan. Then he invites Judith to a great feast. Remember the story of Esther and Haman? The wine is flowing, and Holofernes gets so drunk that this master of armies is unable to master his own passions. He sends everyone out of the tent except Judith in the hopes of getting into bed with her, but then he promptly falls asleep. Judith sees her chance. And just like the biblical stories of Jael and Sisera, or David and Goliath, in the darkness of Holofernes' tent, she takes his sword and chops off his head. The irony is rich. Instead of Holofernes taking Judith to bed, Judith takes off Holofernes' head. Then Judith sneaks out of the camp with Holofernes' head in a bag, and she goes to Bethulia. After showing his head to everybody, she orders the Israelite troops to get ready for battle. In the morning, when the armies discover that Holofernes is dead, they scatter in disarray and are easily defeated by the Israelites. The book concludes with a victory parade and a long poem celebrating Judith and praising Israel's God for saving them. The poem portrays Judith as a new Moses who brought about a new exodus from slavery and oppression. In a great reversal, this lone widow brought down an imperial army through her shrewd wisdom and her trust in God. The poem's final line sticks out, as the words of the people around Judith become the words of the book's author, asking God to vindicate his people before all corrupt and violent nations, and so the story ends. The book of Judith was written after the Israelites had suffered for centuries under the oppressive rule of ancient empires. The author was immersed in the Hebrew scriptures, and he saw within them a pattern of hope. For him, the biblical Babylon was an image of all arrogant human kingdoms that will one day fall by their own corruption. And Judith is a symbol of the way God raises up unlikely deliverers like Moses, Deborah, David, or Esther. The author of Judith read the Hebrew scriptures as a pointer to future hope, that one day God would send the ultimate unlikely deliverer to rescue God's people and overcome the evil that lurks behind violent human empires. And that's what the book of Judith is all about.
So, as we close, if you are ever inclined, read the book of Judith. It's not a true story. It's not inspired, but it is very rich. Again, it draws from the Old Testament a lot. And as you read it, remember that it was written by a Pharisee during this time period. And so the benefit of reading Judith is, not only is it a great story, but also as you read, try to figure out what are the themes in the story. In this video, I touched on a lot of them. The primary one, we just have to trust God and he will always deliver us, okay? You get a window into the mind of a Pharisee by reading this story. Just like you can, read Mark Twain and, Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, and get a window into middle 19th century America. And a lot of the issues going on then. You read a John Grisham novel and you get an insight into the legal profession and things going on in that arena, on and on and on. You can read Judith and get a window into how the Pharisees thought and what their values were. So, comments or questions before we wrap up? All right, well, let's bow in a word of prayer. Father, we love you. We are so grateful for Jesus. Father, we are grateful for the fact that he is our merciful and righteous King. Father, we're grateful for the fact that he serves at your right hand as our great high priest interceding on our behalf. Father, as we think about this period and how it flowed into the times of the New Testament, I want to pray tonight that we will always be vigilant, on the watch for how we allow our cultural setting, things going on politically in the world, etc. Help us to always be vigilant that we don't allow those things to affect our convictions and our values, our biblical faith. Father, when we ask the question, what should we do? How should we live? May we always seek that answer in your scriptures. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
When was Judas written?
Hang on a second. Around the end of the 2nd century, so 120, 100 BC, sometime in that period,